The moment Prince Harry opened his mouth in that silent courtroom, one name detonated like a buried landmine. And it wasn't Meghan, it wasn't the press, it was the woman who never asked to be dragged back into his war. The doors didn't creak like Buckingham Palace gates. There were no flashing tiaras, no royal pomp, no balcony waves, just a wood-paneled courtroom, sterile, cold, unforgiving. Every word recorded, every pause noted, every sentence destined to be replayed, analyzed, ripped apart. Prince Harry sat there not as a prince, but as a man on a mission to expose the British press, to rewrite history, to prove once and for all that he was the victim. That was the plan. But plans collapse when names are spoken that were never meant to be spoken. This trial wasn't supposed to be about love. It wasn't supposed to be about an ex. And it definitely wasn't supposed to resurrect a woman who walked away from royal life more than a decade ago and never looked back. Yet suddenly her name hovered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Chelsy. Say it once and old photos crawl out of archives. Say it twice and headlines from another era resurrect themselves. Say it under oath and suddenly a private woman becomes public property again without ever agreeing to step back into the spotlight. Harry framed this case as David versus Goliath, a lone royal taking on the ruthless media machine. He accused newspapers of hacking phones, intercepting voicemails, stalking movements, monetizing pain. On paper, it looked righteous, clean, heroic, a reckoning years in the making. But courtrooms don't just test facts, they test motives, and sometimes they reopen doors that were closed for a reason. When Harry began talking about his past relationship, the tone shifted. He spoke about private calls, long-distance love, shared trust, emotional strain. He described a relationship suffocated by press intrusion, a romance bruised by constant surveillance. At first, it sounded tender, almost tragic. A young man in love crushed by fame. But listen carefully. Something subtle happened. Chelsy wasn't speaking. She wasn't testifying. She wasn't defending herself. Yet her life, her privacy, her past were being used as evidence. She was no longer a person. She was a prop. A symbol. A supporting character in someone else's courtroom narrative. Here's the part that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Chelsy did the opposite of Harry. She didn't write books. She didn't do documentaries. She didn't sit down for confessional interviews. She didn't revisit the past for sympathy or validation. She left. Quietly. Intentionally. She chose anonymity when staying visible could have brought money, influence, and global attention. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a boundary. And according to what would later surface, it was a boundary she explicitly defended. Before this trial ever reached a courtroom, before lawyers sharpened arguments and cameras lined up outside, a request was allegedly made. Simple, clear, firm. Don't mention me. Don't reopen this chapter. Don't use my name. That request wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't vague. It was direct. And it was ignored. This is where the story stops being about newspapers and starts being about power. Because Harry's entire case rests on consent, the idea that private information should stay private, that no one has the right to exploit someone else's life without permission. That's the moral spine of his argument. And yet, by invoking Chelsy in detail, he may have done exactly what he claims to despise. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the press had dragged her back into headlines against her wishes, we'd call it a violation. So what do we call it when it happens under oath, framed as necessity? Intent and impact are not the same thing. As Harry spoke, describing intimacy, trust, private exchanges, the courtroom listened. But outside those walls, another conversation ignited. Was Chelsy being used to strengthen his case? Was her past pain being repackaged as proof of his victimhood? And most importantly, did she ever agree to any of this? Once her name entered the official record, the machine restarted. Articles resurfaced, old photos circulated. Narratives long buried reemerged. The very system Harry claimed to be fighting roared back to life, fueled not by leaks but by testimony. The irony was brutal. And then something else happened. Something Harry likely didn't anticipate. People close to Chelsy noticed. Not commentators, not royal watchers, people who actually lived the consequences of that silence being broken. For years, they had stayed out of it, trusted that the past would remain where it belonged. But this wasn't gossip. This wasn't speculation. This was sworn testimony broadcast to the world. According to what would later come out, evidence existed. Messages, timelines, proof that the request not to be mentioned had been acknowledged and then overridden. That's when silence stopped being an option. While Harry framed himself as a man reclaiming agency, others began to ask whether he had taken agency away from someone else to do it. And here's the contradiction that makes this story combustible. Harry spoke passionately about privacy being sacred, about how exposure damages lives, about how intrusion leaves scars. Yet the woman at the center of this part of the story had spent years protecting her peace and suddenly found herself pulled back into a global spectacle she never signed up for. No press conference, no statement, no denial, just silence. But silence doesn't mean consent. As the trial rolled on, the narrative outside the courtroom began to fracture. The question was no longer just did the press cross the line, it became did Harry, not legally, morally. Because once you use someone's private life as evidence without their permission, you're no longer just a victim, you're a participant in the same cycle you claim to be breaking. And while Harry was speaking to a judge, someone else was quietly gathering receipts. Not to sell a story, not to fuel tabloids, but to correct the record. Because when proof exists that a boundary was drawn and ignored, the story stops being simple. It becomes dangerous. And what surfaced next didn't just challenge Harry's narrative, it threatened to flip the entire moral balance of this case. And just when it seemed like the damage had already been done, the ground shifted again. Because while the courtroom focused on hacking claims and legal definitions, a quieter storm was gathering outside. One built not on speculation, but on timing, memory, and uncomfortable consistency. People weren't just listening to what Prince Harry said anymore, they were listening to what he didn't say. No acknowledgement of the request. No moment of hesitation. No, I wish I hadn't had to mention her. Just the story told his way, with her silence filling in the gaps. That silence grew louder by the day. Chelsy didn't rush to the press. She didn't post cryptic messages. She didn't issue a statement through friends close to the couple. She did exactly what she had done for years. Nothing. And somehow that nothing started to feel like the most powerful statement in the entire saga. Because the more Harry spoke, the clearer the contrast became. One person reliving the past publicly, repeatedly in interviews, books, documentaries, and now courtrooms. The other person doing everything humanly possible to keep that same past buried. It forced people to ask a brutal question. Was this really about protecting her or protecting his argument? Inside the courtroom, Harry continued to describe the emotional toll of media intrusion during that relationship. He painted a picture of young love under siege, a couple trying to survive constant surveillance, private messages twisted into headlines, moments of intimacy turned into public entertainment, and none of that is hard to believe. The British tabloid system has a long documented history of crossing lines. That's the legal battlefield. That's what this trial was supposed to be about. But outside the legal framework, the emotional framing started to look different. Because every time Harry described her as a victim of the press, he was also making a choice to define her story for her, a choice to present her past through his lens, a choice she reportedly asked him not to make. And here's where the discomfort turned into something sharper. People began revisiting Harry's broader public narrative, his memoir, his interviews, his documentaries. A pattern seemed to emerge, deeply personal stories told in the name of truth, healing exposure. Stories that often involved other people who weren't speaking for themselves. Again, not malicious, not necessarily cruel, but consistent. Harry tells stories to reclaim power, but sometimes those stories involve people who gave up that power on purpose. That's the contradiction that started haunting this trial. Because Harry's moral authority, the thing that gives his fight against the press emotional weight, is built on the idea that consent matters, that privacy is sacred, that no one should have their life exposed without permission. And now, whether he intended to or not, he stood accused in the court of public opinion of crossing that same line. Not with hidden cameras, not with hacked voicemails, but with words, under oath, broadcast globally. Legal analysts stayed careful. They focused on evidence, admissibility, precedent. But cultural commentators, they went somewhere else entirely. They started talking about narrative power. Who gets to tell a story? Who gets to opt out? And what happens when someone's refusal to participate is overridden because their experience is important to someone else's cause? That's where this stopped being a clean hero versus villain tale. Harry can still be a victim of media abuse. The press can still be guilty of intrusion. Both things can be true. But it can also be true that in fighting his battle, he stepped over a boundary he once demanded the world respect. That layered reality is messy. And messy stories don't trend as easily as simple ones. But they stick. As the trial edged closer to its later stages, something else changed: tone. Early coverage framed Harry as bold, brave, determined. Later coverage started using different language: complicated, nuanced, ethically tricky. Those words don't scream scandal, they whisper doubt. And doubt is dangerous for someone whose public role now depends on moral clarity. Because Harry is no longer just a royal spare. He's a public advocate, a speaker on trauma, privacy, mental health, personal autonomy. He's built a platform on the idea that people deserve control over their own narratives. So when it appears, even unintentionally, that he overrode someone else's narrative control, the dissonance hits harder. And then there's the part no one could ignore: timing. Chelsy had stayed out of royal drama for over a decade. Through engagements, weddings, exits, books, interviews, documentaries. She never stepped back in, never commented, never corrected, never capitalized. Until suddenly, without her participation, she was central to a global legal spectacle. That doesn't look like a coincidence. It looks like a reopening. And reopenings have consequences, even if no one meant for them to. The most brutal part? There's no villain speech here. No explosive confrontation. No dramatic reveal on the courthouse steps. Just a quiet moral fracture that kept widening the more people stared at it. Because once the idea takes hold that someone's boundary was known and ignored, every future word gets weighed differently. When Harry talks about protecting others, people will remember this. When he talks about consent, people will remember this. When he talks about media intrusion, people will remember he once became the source of renewed intrusion for someone who had walked away. That doesn't erase his pain. It doesn't erase press wrongdoing. But it complicates the story, and complication is kryptonite to clean public narratives. In the end, this trial may still be remembered for legal precedent, media accountability, and institutional reckoning. But running beneath it will always be another story. Quieter, more personal, harder to resolve. The story of a woman who chose silence, and a man who chose to speak anyway. And the uncomfortable truth that sometimes in trying to rewrite the past, you drag someone else back into a chapter they already closed.